Hi there, this is Maria with Basmati.com. I'm an herbalist and a microbiologist and a regular contributor to their website. I am going to talk just a little bit about making medicinal teas today, and that's a little bit different than making your typical cup of tea that many of you probably do. And the difference is that we're going to be steeping it for a lot longer so that we're getting out that good plant medicine. And so there are a few different ways of making medicinal teas, and it's going to depend on the kind of herbs you're using to make your tea. So, for instance, the one that you're probably most familiar with is called a hot infusion, although you probably don't call it that. And what this is using, water that we've freshly boiled, and we're pouring it over our tea, whether it's loose leaf tea that you've got in your mug or bagged tea. And what we're doing is measuring our tea. So for a medicinal hot infusion, a medicinal cup of tea, generally it's about a teaspoon per 8 ounces of hot water, maybe 2 teaspoons. For commercial tea bags, the amount of tea in those bags varies. It could be 2 teaspoons, it could be 3 teaspoons. So just check the box there. I do a lot of loose leaf teas. And so for the hot infusion, you boil your water, you pour it over a teaspoon of your herb, and you use this method for soft parts. Like this yarrow, for instance. These are dried flowering leaves, flowering tops rather, that are basically the flowers and the leaves of yarrow. And so pretty soft, more delicate plant parts work really well with a hot infusion. Other types of flowers like rose or leaves like lemon balm go really well with this method. Chamomile is commonly made this way. A lot of mint teas are made this way as well. And so you can scale up, 1 teaspoon per 8 ounces of water. But if you are taking multiple doses of your tea for several days or a couple of weeks for a specific issue, you could just make a big jug of tea and store it in the fridge and then just rewarm each cup that you're drinking. Although tea is really a lovely ritual. Making a cup of tea slows you down. Depending on what you're making the tea out of, you can do a little bit of aromatherapy when you're steeping your tea. So making 1 cup of tea at a time, if you're willing to dedicate the time to doing that, is medicine in and of itself. But that's a hot infusion. It's what most of us think of as a standard cup of tea, but you want to steep it longer. So instead of 3 minutes or 5 minutes, I'm going to steep that tea for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes. In fact, I might put a lid on it and steep it all night, depending on what kind of tea it is. And that length of time is going to depend on what you're making. If it's a really aromatic tea, and I'm making a hot infusion out of it, I may not let it go all night. I might just let it go for 15 minutes or so, and that'll be fine. If I want to make a mineral supplement tea, say I'm making a tea out of dandelion leaf or nettle leaf or oat straw or all of those mixed together, I might let that thing go all night to really extract those minerals efficiently into the water. And then again, if you make a big batch of it, you can then store it in the fridge for up to a few days. Now, sometimes you need to make tea out of tougher bits, so bark, seeds, mushrooms, things like that, roots. And so here's, for instance, some cinnamon, which is a bark, pretty hard stuff. And so for cinnamon, sure, you can get a decent tea just by pouring hot water over it, but when I'm using, say, cinnamon mixed with dandelion root, I want to simmer it. I want to do what's known as a decoction. And so in this case, you're going to use the same ratio of dried herbs or plants to water. So 1 to 2 teaspoons per 8 ounces of water. Scale it up. And what you're going to do is add your herb to your water in a pot. I tend to use stainless steel, or if you have a good ceramic type pot, something that's not reactive. Great, don't use aluminum. I don't use iron for this, although some people deliberately do use iron to get the iron in their tea, but it tastes kind of funky. Anyway, you bring your water and your herbs to a boil, reduce the heat, and then simmer. And how long you're going to simmer, again, it's going to depend on what you're making. So for my dandelion cinnamon tea that I'm doing as digestive support, I might simmer that for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, turn off the heat and let it steep for another 10 minutes or even longer, half an hour, whatever. If you get busy and you have to run to the grocery store and come back, that's fine. Just leave it in the pot with the heat off. If I'm making mushroom medicine, say I want to make medicine out of maitake mushroom for blood sugar regulation for a client, I want that to simmer for a couple of hours. And so you really have to babysit that decoction so you don't wind up having 4 fire trucks show up outside of your building like I did a few weeks ago. forgetting about a decoction and letting it go on the stove. So you want to add water back when you're simmering for that long, because even with a lid on, it's going to be evaporating. Sometimes you don't want to add water back. Say you're making elderberry syrup. You're decocting those berries, you're simmering them. You might actually want to cook that liquid layer down lower so that it's thicker to make a syrup out of, but babysit it to make sure that your decoction does not dry out. I have since in the past few weeks actually started setting a timer so that I check my decoction periodically and don't space out. Now, another way of making a tea is called a cold infusion. And you're not actually using cold water. You're simply using room temperature water. It's just called a cold infusion because you're not boiling your water. You're not heating it. Cold infusions work really well for mucilaginous herbs. So this is this is marshmallow root. You would do the same thing with, say, hollyhock or wild mallow or other slimy herbs. That so-called mucilage, those polysaccharides that are the medicine for these plants, don't extract really well in hot water. They extract better at room temperature. And you want an efficient extraction. So you can use that slimy cup of tea to stimulate your immune system or to support a dry digestive tract or lung dryness or what have you. And so other teas that actually do really well with a cold infusion would be things like chamomile. So chamomile works for a hot infusion, but if you want the strongest cup of chamomile you can make, do a cold infusion, because those aromatics and the bitter principles of chamomile that are good for digestion, for example, are going to come out really well at room temperature water with a slow overnight extraction. And so one way to do a cold infusion is to really just bomb your herbs into a jar of room temperature water and let it sit all night with the lid on. If you want to get more sciencey and really make a strong cold infusion, you're going to actually have your herbs stuck in a natural fiber sack. This is very well used. As you can see, it's kind of perma-stained from how many different herbs have been in it. You pre-wet the herbs, so dip it in your water. And then I'm going to show you this in a second, but you're going to suspend that bag of herb, marshmallow root in this case, at the top of the jar. I don't know if you can see the bag right there at the top. And just because of physics, that's going to actually lead to a better extraction of your chemicals. You won't be able to see it on this video, but you'll actually see some of the chemistry, some of the chemicals coming out of the herb and filtering down into the water. And you can just use the lid to keep that bag up at the top. So that's a cold infusion. It's really easy to make. You just let it sit all night. And then, as with the other teas, you can just strain them and keep it in the fridge for a few days. Now, for all of these forms of tea making, if you are making a big batch and storing it in the fridge, you can just heat 1 cup at a time if you like to drink it warm. And I do recommend drinking it warm rather than very cold. And even with the cold infusion, once you've done the steeping and you've made the tea, you can actually then warm it up to drink it. There's no problem there. And so that is tea making. Pretty easy. So happy steeping and happy sipping.